Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Welcome to Vanderbilt Divinity School's exploration of what dreams may come next. We represent Vanderbilt Divinity School as the 4 Black male faculty. Myself, Juan Floyd-Thomas, as a religious historian, Forrest Harris as the venerable director of the Kelly Miller Smith Institute of Black Church Studies, Victor Anderson as our esteemed philosopher of religion and professor of ethics and society, and Herbert Marbury as our dynamic Hebrew Bible scholar. And tonight we are standing in solidarity with the wonderful work and witness of our brilliant VDS womanist colleagues, with whom hopefully many of you all have already engaged on Tuesday evening, and with whom we stand not in any spirit of separation, but in actual solidarity by offering our perspectives and a Black male response in addressing the intersection of Black Lives Matters and the prophetic and pastoral nature of Black faith in the hopes of cultivating and transforming the future. Following our brief remarks, we want to invite those of you all who are joining us to both far and near during this event to ask questions for our Q&A immediately following, with a special effort, and please be mindful of this, to give names of the specific panelists you hope to engage, as well as a topic and a driving theme for your question, so that we can have a rich and robust conversation. Once again, thank you for joining us for the webinar this evening. So we will be addressing the topic at hand in the order that I just described. So as the moderator for tonight's gathering, I'm going to take the liberty of going first. And if I had to put a title to my comments tonight, I would talk about the historic moments that leave us breathless. There are many moments that leave us both literally and figuratively breathless. As mighty and miraculous as the human body is in so many ways, the spark of life within each and every one of us must also be regarded as precious and precarious in nature. Think about some of the most basic necessities in this world. If we lose access to those simple things like food, sleep, water, and air, such a situation can bring us to the very brink of death. For instance, a human being can, by most estimates, go without food for about 3 weeks. The longest recorded time people have gone without sleep is approximately 12 consecutive days. Typically, the average person would only last about 3 or 4 days without water. But according to medical statistics, we cannot survive more than 3 minutes without oxygen. By that standard alone, as we've discovered all too tragically in the recent incidents where the former Minneapolis police officers held down George Floyd and drained him of his last breath, if he was even to have been able to withstand and survive during that 8 minutes and 46-second ordeal in which former officer Derek Chauvin and his accomplices choked the life from him, it would have been a superhuman feat. But for me, I was even more deeply triggered by the sight of George Floyd's dying breath, because it took me back to thinking of seeing my own late mother fighting for her last gasp of air as she succumbed to a misdiagnosed case of metastatic lung cancer in 2017 while crying, "I can't breathe." Seeing the life drained from Mr. Floyd's body forced me to wrestle with the death recently of a dearly beloved relative, Uncle Henry, who contracted and died from COVID-19 back in March, isolated in a hospital ward without any of his loved ones around him. This flood of memories and emotions made me even more mindful of the Hebrew concept of ruach, that divine spirit, the wind, that holy breath as a gift that only originally comes from God. You know, my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Marbury, can explain that infinitely better than I can. But I was taken aback by how much we as human beings take that gift, that sacred gift of breath, for granted until it's finally gone. I've often met personally with a sort of dissonance because of my name, Juan Floyd-Thomas, because on one hand, it seems like a jumble of first names, and on the other hand, it's assumed that a man shouldn't or can't have a hyphenated last name. But given the incidents of the recent weeks and how people have even been more inquisitive about my name, wondering if by chance, with a slight mix of curiosity and pity, whether or not I'm related to George Floyd. The fact of the matter is, I'm not sure whether or not I'm related to him at all in a genealogical sense. But one thing I am certain of, I am related to George Floyd in a sociological and theological sense. We are George Floyd in as much as the specificities of our embodied and existential realities lend themselves to the deeper, more universal truths of the human condition that we share without shame. Much in the same way that our womanist sister colleagues spoke up and spoke out as being Breonna Taylor, we have to say their names and guarantee that they did not die in vain. And we're all trying to avoid asphyxiation because of these times are full and sin sick with racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, and xenophobia in ways that have a stranglehold, a veritable death grip on us all as we try to speak, preach, and teach truth to power to any good person, any person of faith and true conscience in this world, as long as they have an ear to hear. And with our breath, we give praise and whisper prayers that many Black men have uttered for longer than I care to remember every time we think about some run-in with law enforcement, no matter how seemingly innocent. There but for the grace of God go I. So, when I think about the millions of us, not just around the nation, but worldwide, who saw George Floyd crushed under the knee of a cruel and callous police officer, and we were left breathless. But personally, this was triggering on several levels. This society was already crushing the life out of George Floyd as he struggled to make himself constantly and remake himself in the face of constantly frustrated dreams of a successful and sustainable future. The structural inequality of this lopsided economy was choking him. The fact that the original offense that led to his interaction with the police in the first place was allegedly overpassing a counterfeit $20 bill that might not have been his, but certainly isn't a crime worthy of death. The fact that he was a formerly incarcerated person in a society that doesn't provide much grace or mercy to those who've been imprisoned is yet another way that this world was crushing George Floyd. Even worse, it was revealed in his autopsy that George Floyd tested positive for COVID-19. I sometimes wonder if the cops would have even stepped to him if they knew that about his infectious state. Nevertheless, if the coronavirus pandemic, economic panic, and political pandemonium didn't kill him, he ultimately fell victim to the more lethal and loathsome police pandemic. But while many of us were left too emotionally exhausted and mentally overwhelmed, given the seemingly endless onslaught of awfulness that defines the Trump era, we could muster hardly enough strength to look at the viral video of Floyd's murder a month ago on Memorial Day. It was the brave and bold actions of a 17-year-old young woman who never weakened or wavered in recording a moment that left the entire world breathless, in the hopes that what she witnessed would make something, anything positive happen. There was breathlessness for many of us while we wondered what to do next. And then the next day we saw steadily a growing stream of protesters, activists, and just people of good faith and conscience, first by the hundreds, then by the thousands, and now in the millions worldwide. Folks from Atlanta to Australia, from Ghana to the Gaza Strip, from Berlin to Baltimore, from Los Angeles to London, flooding the streets proclaiming Black Lives Matters. We saw rare actions to hold not only these killer cops accountable in Minneapolis, but suddenly there was a bearing witness to a silent and submerged multitude who finally said enough is enough and stayed marching, all the while demanding a better world for ourselves, our families, friends, neighbors, and even strangers. In the face of these largely peaceful and positive acts of civil disobedience, we've seen too many police departments around the nation respond to talks of de-escalation and demilitarization with a clenched fist rather than an open hand. My most breathless moment recently was a few weeks ago on Monday evening watching MSNBC when we saw protesters who were rightfully and reasonably exercising their First Amendment rights in Lafayette Park outside the White House, the People's House, being tear gassed and trampled by federal troops just so Trump could crawl out of his self-imposed exile in his bunker to strut across the street for a scandalous photo op, misusing the Bible as a prop and St. John's Church as a backdrop. I never feared more for the fate of this nation than seeing such a horrific moment play out in real time. However, just a few days later, my soul was renewed when DC Mayor Muriel Bowser renamed that very same patch of earth Black Lives Matter's Plaza. What we're living through right now is what James Baldwin would have called the hard work of achieving our country and making this country what it always could have and should have been. So to briefly return to the issue of breath and how it informs the work I currently do here at Vanderbilt, it makes me think of my early upbringing in the Catholic Church and my exposure to Latin terms. I was literally blown away by the fact that the words respiration, inspiration, and conspiracy etymologically share a common linguistic root in the word spire, to breathe. And I'll emphasize the issue of conspire, which means to breathe together. In and of itself, the word does not have a wicked or evil connotation, but has been hijacked by the worst people with the most wretched of intentions. On the one hand, we have witnessed for far too long in human history conspiracies of hatred, those acts that have been marked by cruel, chaotic, corrupt, and criminally minded political and corporate leaders who presently rule the land, trying to crush the very life from each and every one of us because they don't want to see any changes in the status quo. On the other hand, we've witnessed a growing conspiracy of helplessness that has increasingly pervaded our culture and society, from the courthouse to the state house to the church house, and creeps into newsrooms, hospital rooms, classrooms, and even our bedrooms, that tells us it's perfectly acceptable that some of us have to die grim and grisly deaths needlessly and should never know anything known as a safe or sacred space to call our own. But when I look at my work as a religious historian, I'm engaged in chronicling a Black history of liberation that recognizes the reality that reality of those first two conspiracies, but also gives voice and vision to what I see as a conspiracy of hope. Several years ago, I was invited by our then director of admissions to participate in a visitation day at VDS to promote KMSI, our Black Church Studies program, alongside our other concentrations at the Divinity School. During the Q&A of that session, a young Black man, I had never seen him before and I haven't seen him since, asked a question and simply stated, "Do you all teach that liberation theology?" So, taken aback, I paused, I took in a breath, and then I responded, "Well, yes. And what would you have us teach otherwise? A theology of enslavement?" Not trying to throw shade or not trying to be snarky, but really grappling in that moment with the issue of, if we're not teaching liberation, if we're not talking about human freedom and flourishing, what on earth are we doing individually, collectively, globally? For me, African-American religious history is advancing a counter narrative of a struggle for human freedom and flourishing that, while being far from perfect, has been throughout our existence on this planet, been striving towards something that would approximate life and liberation. As I've always upheld, it has been both an academic and an activist concern that links divine justice to social justice so that all people in every part of God's dream of creation can enjoy freedom, justice, and equality with dignity and decency. Black religion in this spirit works best and fullest when it merges aspects of orthodoxy, fancy $5 word for right thinking, alongside orthopraxis, or what we could hope to be best action or best practices. Put another way, it is perfectly fine for folks to engage in Black religion in order to understand how we preach, pray, sing, and minister. But we also need to be about the work of planning, protesting, strategizing, and mobilizing. In this way, we have to guarantee that the prophetic and the pastoral dimensions of Black faith are never seen as enemies or strangers to one another, but are seen in actuality as coexisting in perfect harmony side by side. When we achieve that glorious synergy in our principles and practices rooted in Black faith, that would be the best possible way to leave, at least me, truly breathless forevermore. Thank you. Dr. Harris, if you would.
Yes, thank you, Professor Thomas, Juan, for framing this so well. I direct the Black Church Studies program at Vanderbilt over these 3 decades. And I must say that this moment in the life of my work at the Divinity School as director of the Institute is one that reminds me of the horrific pain and struggle of my heritage, born, raised in Memphis, Tennessee, August 1949. I give my age away, but Emmett Till was mutilated and murdered in August 1955. So my life emerged in a period wherein the race culture and hate culture against Blackness was prominent. So I'm very much aware of this moment, that to be alive and to be able to interact with my colleagues this evening in this horrific moment in context of racial animus and hate and protest is indeed a grace moment for all of us, a liberative moment as well to speak into this crisis in a way that helps all of us keep hope alive, as Jesse Jackson would say, but at the same time challenge the very system that continuously create the Emmett Till scenarios, and now the George Floyd, now the Breonna Taylor, and now Ahmaud Arbery. So as Juan framed it, as I indicated so well in terms of all the touchstones of this pain has always been a pain that Black people have carried privately, secretly, because many of the stories were not told. Many of the murders and many of the incidents were never heard of. So we come to this moment knowing that many of the people that relate to us are unsung, untold parts of our story. So it accumulates the pain as we witness the public murder of George Floyd. It accumulates and makes the burden of our humanity even more than ever, because we know and realize that many of our fellow sisters and brothers suffer, and yet the world does not know their suffering. But what I am at this point struggling with as it relates to the work we do, the way in which we seek to keep liberation at the center of our vision and work, is how do we not only deal with this pain in terms of how it may be healed, but how do we find ways to liberate ourselves through the domains that we now claim as domains of safety and hope and justice. And one domain has been through and in the Black church. We have thought that that domain would be a safe refuge for Black people to advocate for their own humanities and to find Black faith very active into the daily existential issues that they face. But now this COVID-19 and COVID-16-19 challenges the very soteriological frame of the Black church as it is related to the conservative colonial mindset of American Christianity. No longer is that theology, no longer is that frame of reference in terms of spirituality able to save us and provide safety for us as we theologically imagine how to liberate ourselves and how to challenge the very structures and the very systems that perpetuate that pain. James Baldwin said once, in terms of that pain and the theological frameworks wherein we have accepted ourselves to understand ourselves, said that the only thing left for Black people to do is to accept their own humanity and not let any other canon or narrative define that humanity for us. If that is the case, Black theological understandings of that humanity has made its attempts to explicate and critique American Christianity, whiteness, white privilege, and all the canonization of definitions of our humanity that has pretty much left our humanity undefined, but defined by them, but undefined by us. I'm interested in this period, which may be a tipping point, but I think it ought to be a turning point, to turn upside down that theology that does not save us, that theology that does not liberate us, and the ways in which the church in its own rituals and its own sometimes colonial ways of understanding Christianity, because it has been passed on to their thinking, how it does not save us, how it continues to oppress us. And what tools of freedom, what is in our toolbox that will help us now understand George Floyd? Because it's just not about the policing culture that killed him. That's one system. But the many systems that intersectionally play into a police culture of violence. So it's just not about how we deal with a reforming of a police culture that continues to be violent against Black life. But how do we use this moment? How do we make sure that at this particular juncture and threshold of our pain, we take advantage of leveraging our power, our voice, and our protest against the systems that continue to oppress us? We can no longer expect that to happen, even if and when others join us. And we are very aware of how diverse the protests have been in the streets of America. White people joining into this moment, raising their voice alongside of Black Lives Matter. But we cannot let even the diversity that that represents center the meaning of our humanity and how we are to deal with this moment in terms of our own protest. Because if we're not careful, whiteness will recenter itself even in this protest moment. Whiteness will define how to solve the problems. Whiteness will determine how it is to be healed, rather than the humanity of the very people who have suffered so long and suffered so broadly in struggling against racism in this country. I'll conclude with this statement as it relates to what Juan has said so eloquently and touched on so many of the points of what the Black church domain means. One thing that it means is that the Black church must, in terms of its leadership, deal theologically, ethically, with undoing the internalized oppression and the colonial understandings of Black humanity in a way that brings hope and breathes new life into the sense of who we are as a people. Secondly, it must be about action and reflection in a way wherein we bring new interpretations of our humanity into the domain of these systems of oppression to humanize those systems, transform those systems by virtue of our own understanding of how they have damaged our own humanity and our own lives. And lastly, we cannot think that the Black church can be an instrument of liberation if it does not profoundly love the people for whom they serve, meaning that the Black church itself must rethink its own way of loving Black life rather than through the lens of whiteness and measuring itself against whiteness. And I am appreciative just to hear my other colleagues as it relates to all of these issues. We all are in pain and we all are struggling to be healed from that pain, but we cannot heal ourselves without healing our brothers and sisters. I pass it on now to our next colleague, Herbert Marbury. Herb, you must unmute yourself.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. Thank you, Dr. Harris and Dr. Floyd-Thomas, for your eloquent ways of framing this conversation. I am going to add my own framing, and I'll try to do this within the 3-minute time limit. The other Saturday, I marched on Legislative Plaza downtown. And as I stood there with thousands of other protesters, I could not help but feel differently about this new iteration of the movement. The energy felt different, the passion felt different, the diversity and the unity all felt new this time. And I kept telling myself that I hope that it is different this time. I hope that this time we will begin the work of creating the deep systemic change that we have longed for since 1619. As a biblical scholar, I'm reminded of the African-American spiritual, Mary, Don't You Weep. The song tells the story of Mary and Martha, whose brother Lazarus had just died. And in the biblical story, Jesus goes to the tomb and fixes the problem by raising Lazarus from the dead. But in our African-American spiritual tradition, that doesn't seem to be enough. The song says, Mary, don't you weep, Martha, don't you moan, not because Lazarus was raised from the dead, but in the song, our ancestors summoned their hermeneutical imaginations and reached back to the Hebrew Bible for the response from God that they needed. It was disruptive. It was anachronistic. It violated all of the rules of biblical hermeneutics. But I believe that that's what this moment calls for. They took the Bible and improvised on the political economy of racism that had marginalized them because they were confident about two things. One, they were confident about the value of their humanity. In other words, they knew way back then that their Black lives mattered, and they were confident about the power of their God. And so the song says, not because Lazarus was raised from the dead, but because Pharaoh's armies were drowned in the Red Sea. In other words, the celebration comes because the empire's systems of oppression have been dismantled. And when I say empire system, I mean the tenacious systems of white supremacy. I mean, those systems that don't go away just as a result of protest. These are systems that require the daily, relentless, and tedious work of constructing policies and working through the bureaucracies long after the marchers have returned to business as usual. This work asks us, will you stay on the battlefield for my Lord? How long will you stay on the battlefield for my Lord? Because disrupting those systems becomes long and deep work. And so I've come to believe that the marchers And the marches and the protests that have followed in response to the killings of Black and brown men and women, not just in the last few weeks, but over the last several years, each attempted to bring perhaps some measure of justice to individual families. In some way, they are similar to Jesus returning to Bethany to respond to Mary and Martha. But one thing we know about protests in the United States is that their energy is finite, and that the attention span of the American body politic is woefully short, particularly if we are counting on continued white investment in this movement. The Black church, if it has looked for solidarity from its white evangelical counterparts, has once again been left to fight this battle alone. It is as if Dr. Martin Luther King's letter to a Birmingham jail could be written all over again today. I mean, those mainline white churches that King encountered 60 years ago have only further developed their theologies of white supremacy and Christian nationalism. This time, they're just masquerading as the gospel. And so my hope is that in this conversation, we begin to do something different. My hope is that in this conversation, we begin to articulate ways that faith communities can move from reacting every time a Lazarus is cut down by the police. We can move from that to working on ways to reconfigure institutions that hold together the systemic racism that keeps us all under the knee of power. Now, not to limit our conversation to, or not even to limit the movement to police brutality, but when I think about ways to reconfigure systems, for example, I'm thinking about what Camden, New Jersey has done.
Herb, you're muted. Yeah, you
Am I
were
muted? Am I muted?
Now you good now.
So as I was saying, not to limit our conversation to, or the movement to police brutality, but for example, I think of what Camden, New Jersey did with this police department over a 7-year period. I think that's a model that every city in the United States needs to investigate. You see, I really want this time to be different because folk like my mother, who participated in the sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina, and so many others of that generation are tired, weary from battling white supremacy all of their lives. For them, and for my nephews, who made me so proud 2 weeks ago as they stood in protest in Atlanta, young men, 17 and 18 years old, defiant with their fists raised high. For all of them, I would like for this conversation to point us to a place where we might be able to say to the Marys and Marthas who represent the men and women who have lost sons and daughters, wives and husbands, that we may be able to say to them like that song, don't you weep, don't you moan, because we are about the work of dismantling the empire. And this time it will be different, because this time we will make sure that we drown Pharaoh's armies. I'll hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Anderson.
I really did not expect to go last, but I'm happy to do so. Only because everything that's been said before, I'm going to try to frame under what I'm calling the cultural logic of policing America. Mm-hmm. And that this logic of policing America is rooted in the very colonizing practices that brought this country into existence, whose fundamental logic is capitalism in itself, greed, capitalism, and land grab. So my remarks are really framed by what the great theologian and philosopher Howard Thurman called in his book, The Luminous Darkness.
Mm.
Howard Thurman wrote a book entitled Luminous Darkness in 1965, describing and exposing the great evils that segregation overwhelms the US in pervasive cultural and spiritual darkness. And yet, the Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, broke through the long night of sheer darkness as a beam of penetrating light, enough to ground a beacon of hope in dark times. His metaphor was striking. Indeed, we are living against overwhelming darkness today. A pervasive darkness that appears hovering over all. In it, the forces of evil exercise a freedom that was made possible by America's missionizing and colonizing sovereignty. These powers form together a perfect storm in founding of this new society, making for a social contract predicated on violence and domination in the interest of land grab, cheap labor, and hegemonic control of mythologized wastelands. Wastelands free and open, without borders. Wastelands ripe for redeeming, and which were justified by Christian missions and commercial wealth. Laying in the wake of this civilizing venture were indigenous peoples and the need for a cheap labor force of enslaved African peoples. In Democracy in America, de Tocqueville comments, I quote him, "The American republics of the present day are like companies of adventurers to explore and common the wastelands of the New World, and busied in flourishing in trade. The passions that agitate the Americans most are not their political, but their commercial passions," unquote. The political order set by the great founding documents of the Declaration of Independence and the preamble to the US Constitution play only a secondary role to commercial and economic forces played out on the backs of the disenfranchised, the poor, enslaved, and criminalized, who for the sake of protecting the powers of America's elite are forever surveilled and policed from slave codes to our contemporary penal codes. Policing America is a constitutive logic of these United States of America. Wherever we began to see the political directed towards correcting our social ills, you will simultaneously find at every moment of social change where the disenfranchised finally began to believe and have faith in an America that has not yet been, in the words of Langston Hughes. As with the first Reconstruction, these social forces of change are simultaneously met by policing technological tactics of violence, lynching, and pervasive criminalizing powers of Jim Crow, anti-social forces, and legislative setbacks. And what some have called the Second Reconstruction, taking shape under the shadow of the Civil Rights era and its legislative social change, which was signified by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and LBJ's Great Society platforms, each were accomplished by large-scale protests, marches, and thousands of voices of a young generation that was galvanized around peace over war and justice and racial equality. What gains, which seemed as if finally a new heaven and a new earth were breaking into the pervasive darkness, simultaneously protecting the economic and social privileges of American market forces were wartime militarizing policing tactics of the Black Panther Party, FBI surveillance, each armed with guerrilla-like tactics that silence militant rage and its voices, such as with the gunning down of Fred Hampton in Chicago, where I grew up, and the jailing of Angela Davis. And all this while making the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X perpetual mysteries. What we saw as good and positive in the advancement of the poor, Black and brown peoples in that so promising era were met with increasing militarizing powers of America policing. Dismay would lead Professor Dirk Bell to write a book entitled "And We Are Not Saved: The Elusive Quest for Racial Justice" in 1987. Bell laments, "We are not saved," echoes down through the ages to give appropriate voice to present concerns of those who, flushed with the enthusiasm generated by a Supreme Court decision in 1954, holding that segregated public schools are unconstitutional, pledged publicly that the progeny of American slaves would at last be free by 1963, unquote, the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation. On the cusp of this second Reconstruction, Bell exclaims, "We were filled with jubilant euphoria. Veterans of racial bias and social hostilities who believed that they had finally and permanently achieved the reform of the laws that had been for centuries vehicles for the oppression of men, women, and children," unquote. Reflecting on the gains of the Second Reconstruction, Bell sadly remarks, "We could not have seen that less than 3 decades later, that achievement would be so eroded as to bring us once again into faithful and frightful coincidence with Jeremiah's lament," unquote. He concludes, "With the realization that the salvation of racial equality has eluded us again, questions arise from the ashes of our expectations and hopes." Now, some 33 years after Bell's dark lament, the question of expectations meet us today, full of Jeremiah's prophetic lament and yet hope. To be sure, our tears will not stop flowing. Our rage will not be quieted. Our frustrations will not be comforted. And like Rachel so long before us, weeping over her children because they are no more, even so today we now weep. They are no more, for they have fallen to the mercenary policing, armed with unaccountable liability for their death-dealing tactics over the lives of Black and brown people, women, men, children, and transgendered women and men, and so many others unaccounted for. Their blood cries out in an unsilenced breath, "Stop killing us." And have we reason for hope from this pervasive darkness? Reverend William Barber II, president of the Poor People Campaign, a national call for moral revival, speaks of our time as a kairos of a possible third reconstruction, which is the title of his memoir. What does he have in mind? This is what he says: "I am not a politician, I'm a pastor. The job of a pastor is to touch people where they're hurting and to do what is possible to bind up their wounds. You can only do this sort of work locally among people whose names you know and who likewise know you. But you cannot do it honestly without at some point becoming a prophet. Something inside the human spirit cries out against the injustices of inequality. We know people who have to choose between food and medicine in a country where CEOs make more in an hour than their lowest paid employees make in a month. He sees this present time as anticipating a third reconstruction of the social order, an order that requires radically motivated moral movement for social change. He says, the movement we have witnessed, the movement we must need in our moral movement. His book, he says, is about how a moral movement can come home to where you are, exposing 21st century injustice and giving us a shared vision for a third reconstruction to save the soul of America. Anything less, I fear, will mean the self-destruction of our nation. Amidst the din of those who incite old fears by saying it is time to take back America, a moral movement has arisen to insist that we must move forward together, not one step back. The reconstruction we are engaged in aims for nothing less than liberty and justice for all, unquote. But such a faith is a hard one to maintain on earth. De Tocqueville's analysis looms heavy over our demands for justice and racial equality. The political passions for liberty, justice, and equality are locked simultaneously with the interests of the economically powerful elites, who with every reconstruction of the social order are guarded over by mercenary tactics of American policing, on whose loyalty they count for protection and safety at the disposal of poor and Black and brown peoples. And yet, there shines in this darkness a glimmer of hope, as Thurman saw in the luminous darkness. A light shines through the darkness. Perhaps, just perhaps, it is enough to offer us a measure of warrant for Reverend Barber's prophetic and pastoral hopes for a third reconstruction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, one and all. Thank you so much, Dr. Harris, Dr. Marbury, and Dr. Anderson. Now I'm going to turn to our program coordinator, Shatika Brown, who will pose the questions that are coming through our Q&A feed. Shatika, are you there?
Yes, Dr. Floyd-Thomas, I am here. One of our first questions comes from Dr. Floyd-Thomas herself. And that question is, let's see here. How should we reconfigure the disciplines of history, Bible, religion, and theological studies for pragmatic religion?
I'll take the prerogative to step back, but Dr. Harris, if you have any comments, I allow you to go forth.
One of the things that I think, in terms of a discipline, I think we need to develop our own canon for Black faith rather than the conservative ways in which white theologies or colonialized thinking and imagination has helped us or has attempted to describe who we are, what our faith should be. And I think that discipline is certainly a part of the theological imagination that our ancestors and our patriarchs brought in their tenacity, in their mind to resist all forms of oppression against their Black bodies. We must continuously forge the strength of that tenacity into our theological imaginations as we look at the brutality and the way in which dehumanizing Black life still continues in our current context. So I think one of the disciplines is theological imagination around a canon of Black faith, wherein a supernatural kind of currency cannot debunk our cultural currency, our own experience as it relates to how we understand our humanity and how we understand that humanity in light of God, in light of what it means to be human. So that would be my first response to one of the disciplines. As it relates to the Black church, I think it must rethink those ways of imagining humanity, Black humanity, separate and apart from the colonial canons that have been given to it, especially around soteriology. Soteriology cannot be separated from justice to Black bodies. It cannot be separated from the politics and the sociological systems that impact Black life. So any soteriological understanding of Black faith as it moves into the areas of liberation has to be reimagined. I think of a passage in 2 Kings where it says when Judah was faced with oppression and exile, Hezekiah said, once it was reported to him that the Assyrians were about to take over and exile them, he says, the children have come to the point of birth and there is no strength to deliver them. And I think the point of birth that we have come to in this new era is that the young people, the millennials, the Black Lives Matter group, are attempting to name a new era of what it means to be Black and free and human. And that discipline has to take place within the confines of our theological imagination in the Black church, if the Black church is to be seen and be relevant for this time in which we are going through.
Thank you. On the heels of what my dear colleague has already said, and following in what I already mentioned previously in my own remarks, I would say that history has always been a pragmatic affair, but it depends on who's writing the history.
Yes.
Right. I go back to Chinua Achebe, the author of Things Fall Apart, and he famously said that if you don't like the story, write your own. Right. And not as a work of fiction, but as a work of fact. Here we are, in this day and time right now. Tomorrow is Juneteenth, right? There was threatened to be a Trump rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma on tomorrow that got moved to, way far into the future, Saturday. But the idea that for too many people in this nation, the twin concerns, the terror of what happened during the Tulsa race riot that destroyed Black Wall Street, but also the bittersweet triumph of Juneteenth, the final and inevitable emancipation of enslaved Black folks in Texas, right? That twin history was so long forgotten or overlooked by many segments of our society. And it took this, as I mentioned before, this threat of a MAGA rally for many people to even know that these things existed or understand the depth of concern and regard that these hold within African-American history, right? What I often argue is that we have to work to make history part of our usable past, right? To borrow an expression that was already shared by one of my colleagues, right? That we have this toolkit. We are provided by our ancestors, right? Mm-hmm. By those folks who survived some of the great terrors, but also experience some of the great joys of this thing called life that they've handed down to us. And part of that toolkit is our history. But our history has to be something that we embrace and not try to escape. So that's, at least in some regards, how I believe we have to consciously and conscientiously remake history as a pragmatic endeavor, rather than something that takes on abstract or metaphysical kind of dimensions and every now and then touches ground.
Dr. Marbury, we have a question from you from Justin Riley, who is an MTS graduate of 2010. He says, thank you all for taking time to share. Dr. Marbury, you mentioned how protests are important, yet have limited long-term impact due to the short attention span of the culture. Protests are essential, along with many other forms of speaking and acting against injustice. They speak to the soul of America. What else can we collectively do to heal and reorient the soul of America?
Thank you, Justin, for the question. I do think the history of protests is a history which has shown that while the impact may not be short, but the protest, the energy for protest itself has been short. And so I think in particular, I look at the civil rights movement, 55 and beginning of 55, and then by 65, I think my colleague, Dr. Juan Floyd-Thomas, historian can better articulate this, but by 65, America's attention begins to turn to the Vietnam War. And we begin to move away from the questions, the issues around civil rights. It in our own era, I've seen for example, the Occupy Wall Street movement had, kind of comes and goes, and other movements have appeared on the scene, captured a burst of energy, and yet we haven't seen the deep kind of structural change that that these movements purport to approach. And so to your question, I think one of the ways that we have to think about healing is what can the church do? What does faith do in terms of moving us from places of brokenness to places of healing, where we actually live into the America we say we are? And what does it mean when we claim that all of us are children of God? What does it mean that when we claim that each one of us, if we can imagine in each one of us a certain humanity that is valuable? I think that this is something that the work of religion, the work of faith, and in my own context, the work of the Black church has to do. I think protests are a way of bringing a certain salience to an issue. But after the protests are over, the real healing has to be done in community. And while the real healing is being done in community, I think at the same time, we have to work to dismantle the kinds of structures that spark the protests in the first place, these structures that marginalize and do everyday violence to people's lives. And so I think that those two have to go hand in hand. So when I made the comment, you're absolutely right. I'm not saying about the long-term work of protests, because protests in this day and age seem to come and go. And we enter a moment where we get excited about it. We feel it. We feel something. It feels different this time, but at some point, whether it's COVID, whether it's some national issue that arises, something takes our attention off the ball, and the energy is sucked out of the movement. But these structures are enduring. And so I think we have to focus on dismantling the structures that are enduring, and use the protests as ways of catalyzing energy, but recognizing that protests themselves are not durable enough to create the kind of change that we want.
I just want to piggyback on what my dear colleague, Dr. Marbury said. And I'll hit with three and then I'm out. First, America hasn't always proven itself to be a Protestant nation, but we were born as a protest nation, right? Mm-hmm. The fact that in the days even before the American Revolution, Crispus Attucks was the first person to die in the American Revolution as a Black man in Boston Square during the Boston Massacre, right? To borrow from what Dr. Anderson was sharing so mightily just a few moments ago, right? The blood of the righteous cry out that it not be shed or spilled in vain, right? This nation was born in protest, right? Allegedly born to resist imperial domination. Now we have to ask ourselves whether we were ever truly the first democratic republic or we are the last dying empire. That's something that has to be on the table for America to think about. But when we talk about the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, the idea that as much as Dr. Martin Luther King and the protesters were taking over the streets, we also had within the Capitol a partner, an ally in terms of Adam Clayton Powell, who was head of one of the most powerful congressional committees in the nation. As the protesters were on the street, he was working within the State House and the Capitol, pushing legislation that became the bedrock of the Great Society, some of the most liberal laws, including the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and countless of the Immigration Act of 1965, countless pieces of legislation that transformed this nation. So we can't discount the power that protests, but also public policy have to work in synergy in some regards of sympathy. The last thing I want to try to lift up and get people to reckon with is the power of an idea that's time has come, right? It was just 4 short years ago, if you think back to the summer of 2016, when if folks said Black Lives Matters in public, they were going to be shouted down and, like barked at and all this kind of stuff. Now you got Mitt Romney and Roger Goodell, Starbucks and McDonald's, proclaiming Black Lives Matters. Now on blast, now that the term that's getting people clutching their pearls is defund the police. Now I think NWA had another 3-word phrase for law enforcement that might be a little bit more provocative, but let's go with defund the police. In a town I know well and a city that Dr. Marbury is proud to call home, Atlanta, because of civil rights protests, because of the power of the movement, that city has known roughly 50 years of continuous Black mayoral leadership. The building of a I would say a very robust African-American middle class, right? Not a perfect city, but in the wake of the Rayshard Brooks murder, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms was able to respond and react in a way that was rightful and necessary. And then the police department, the APD, decides that they want to catch the blue flu, and roughly 50% of those police officers just call in sick or vanish. Well, guess what? In a city that was otherwise, because of its large Black population, considered ungovernable or unruly, or the city has not disappeared. Atlanta did not vanish or wither, right? The idea that a night without police officers, Atlanta still stands. So the idea that maybe, just maybe, if we rethink our approach to how, not even just dealing strictly with the police, but how our government, how the state interacts with Black humanity, right? Maybe if somebody had called Rayshard Brooks an Uber, maybe if somebody had let him just walk home or call his sister and get a lift from her, maybe the controversy wouldn't have gone as far as it did. But the idea that the protests empowered a city government and created a situation where hopefully we have a more responsible and responsive situation than what we've been allowed to imagine is possible. That's all I would say.
Dr. Anderson, we have a question for you. And this question comes from Crystal April Owens from Facebook. How can we teach our youth to define themselves and not allow society and the media to do it?
Okay, thank you, Crystal. I think we have to think and realize that we are generationally connected. That is, our identities are not just formed as little atoms that comes along and get connected. Rather, our identities are brought along through the interactions with others. And so we have to model in our own practices and our own leadership and our own relationship to young people who come after us and who we produce through birth, through fostering, through adoptions, and even through friendships as teachers and guides. To create within our young people a sense that they matter also requires them to know that they matter. It's not enough to feel I matter. They must know I matter. And that sense of knowing that I matter comes through their interaction with how we love them. So much of the love that we talk about, too little of it is often displayed in our institutions toward our young people. Consequently, they find their identity solely among themselves, solely in isolation from those institutions and structures which nurture our own sense of identity, our own sense of place in the world. And so, Crystal, I would say that we have an obligation as a moral community to lift our young people up in the highest dignity, self-dignity, without constraining their eminent freedom to pursue and to live out their freedom in ways that they constitute for all of us. I'm going to use a philosophical phrase. They constitute for all of us a plenitude of being. With every mode of difference in identity that our generations, our community produces, collectively, we are all fuller, richer, and constitute a plenitude of flourishing. So difference from me in the world of identity making, rather than being a constraint against our communities, really keeps our communities open to the future. I think as an educator, if I'm not transformed by what I'm teaching, I can't expect my students and those under me to be transformed. If they could see in me the transformation of what Black history means, or what the songs that we sing, or the musicology that we produce, or the churches that gave us faith, if they can't see transformation that counts in these institutions, then how can we expect transformation to come about in the identities that our young people are shaping? In other words, we are mutually interdependent in the forming of those identities that will carry us into the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, in this moment, I don't even want this conversation to end. It's been 13 or so weeks since I've seen all of y'all in physical presence. So I know it's been too long and too overdue a conversation, but in order to honor the time that we have together, we're going to wrap up, but that doesn't mean that the conversation ends. Please, even now, we're still collecting questions and gathering them up so that we can react and respond to them offline. So Shatika, are there any other pressing matters that we can announce right now, or?
We just ask that everyone join us tomorrow for a talkback conversation with Damian Durr and Quentin Cox. That will be at 12 noon tomorrow, and we have it linked for registration in the chat, and we can put that in the chat again for you all to register, but we look forward to that conversation tomorrow.
Okay. Thank you so much. And thank you one and all. Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Herb. Thank you, Forrest. I know he had to depart, but we thank him all the same.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you, Victor.
Thank you all. And
Shatika
to everyone
and
out there, praying for better, brighter days.
Here, here.
Find hope and strength in the struggle.
Ashe.
Ashe.
Shatika, you'll have to stop the Facebook broadcast.